Testing, testing. Am I on? Thanks, everyone. Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Braxton Hunter, and today we're going to be taking a look at a debate between David Wood and Michael Shermer. Now, this is going to be a fun one, I think, because there are several things about this debate that I like. By the way, I'm thinking that what I might start doing is whenever there's not something, a current debate that's just happened, I may go grab a debate that I really enjoyed from years ago, maybe, and we go over it like this, because I think there's some things to be gleaned from that we may miss or may have forgotten about for those of us that saw it. And for many of you, maybe you never even saw a particular debate. By the way, thank you so much, Jay Now. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, for that super chat. Really, really do appreciate that. Unbelievable. Thank you so, so much. So I'm thinking of doing that. Now, this debate is pretty exciting to me. This happened in 2016. I was privileged to be on David Wood's show not too long ago, partly because some of you mentioned to him that he ought to have me on. And so I really, really do appreciate that. And it was a lot of fun. And David has a really entertaining style, to watch him debate and just to watch him talk. It's very entertaining. He annoys some people because he is kind of bombastic and pretty blunt, but and Adam K says, is there going to be time for a Q&A at the end? Yeah, probably. We'll try to get there toward the end if we have time. So yeah, if you have a question or a statement or something that you want read, put at Trinity Radio in it so that I can easily see it, and then hopefully at the end of the stream we'll have time to go over some of that. But there's a couple of interesting things about this debate that I think make it more than just entertainment, and that is, we're used to hearing a handful of theistic arguments or a resurrection case, or in the case of a presuppositional approach, we're used to that approach and ones like it. But what we get here is something that is very different. Now, it's not that the point that's being made hasn't been brought out before, but it's that it just typically isn't brought out this way in this sort of a debate. And so I don't know that David's debate opponent, Michael Shermer, was prepared for it. Jim Amberg, thank you so, so much. David had a really unique argument for this debate. I think so. And on that point, Jim and others, I think that what's so interesting about this approach, some might have heard it and thought, I don't know that this is as compelling as, say, one of the theistic arguments or the resurrection case. Or someone might have missed the point and thought that all he was doing was making a grand appeal to authority, which is what I think that Shermer thought for at least part of the debate. I do think Shermer eventually figured it out, but I think he thought that for a while, and some of you may have thought that. Some of you may have seen what David was trying to do and gotten the point, but the heaviness of it, the seriousness of it, didn't sink in. And that's an important thing. As I've thought back on this debate as time has gone by, I've repeatedly realized and appreciated how powerful it was. So I think that that's a good thing for us to consider. Also, and I know we haven't looked at this yet for those of you that don't know much about it, but one of the things that you often hear is, well, Christians were the ones that pioneered the scientific revolution, and we, Christians giving toward these projects is what resulted in a lot of the medical and scientific and institutions of higher education and all those sorts of things. And you might think, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point for Christians to make. I mean, why wouldn't they make that point, right? But does it really count for anything? And I think what this debate shows is that it does count for something. And so we're going to go ahead and jump in just a few moments and take a look at this and see exactly what is being said. So before we do, let me go ahead and familiarize you. Now that this, toward the beginning of this video, we're going to see several things that are lengthier clips. Now, they're not really long, but I'm going to give more time to the clips than I typically do, particularly for David, because what I'm wanting to do is allow him to speak to his own argument so you understand exactly what he's trying to do. To set you up for that, here is my summation of it so that you have that going in, because it would be very easy to misunderstand what he's trying to accomplish with this argument. So what he's trying to say is, look, there are many scientific hypotheses that are tested all the time. Individual experiments. Someone has a hypothesis, they go and test that and see, does it support the hypothesis? That happens all the time in science. But science itself is based upon a hypothesis, and every time science is done, it is a testing of that hypothesis. He calls this the hypothesis, like the grand overarching. We could think of it as a meta hypothesis. It's the hypothesis over which, above the scientific method itself, and all the other ones serve to support it. And that hypothesis is a theistic one, not an atheistic one. It is a theistic one, specifically a Christian theistic one, in that the sort of presumptions that we bring to science are grounded in Christian theism, or are the natural outflow of Christian theism. And they are three: that the universe is intelligible and rational and can be understood, that we are the sorts of beings that can apply reasoning and to this intelligible universe and figure things out about it and probe the mysteries of the cosmos. And we do that all the time. And that it's a good thing. It's a desirable thing, and it's a good thing to do that. Those are the three things. So basically what he's arguing is this is a hypothesis that Christians primarily, at least in terms of the scientific revolution, it's not that there weren't people doing science before, but in terms of the scientific revolution, this was the hypothesis that the universe can be understood, that we are the sorts of beings that can understand it, and that it's a good thing to do that. Why is that important, and why does that indicate theism? Because if there is a God that created everything, and created us as a part of the goal for the physical universe, that rational creatures would come about, then we might suppose that he created the world to follow certain principles, rules that are able to be investigated, that make sense of the way the world is, that there would be sort of a language to it, and that we would secondarily have minds that would be able to explore that successfully, whereas other animals can't, and that it would make sense. And that we would see this as a good thing, so that we would want to explore what some theologians might call the book of nature. The book that God wrote, not the special revelation of the Bible, but the book of nature that we can examine. So that's kind of the argument. And so his point is that every time any scientific hypothesis is carried out, it is support for the meta hypothesis that is at base a theistic hypothesis, a Christian theistic hypothesis. And in that way, it disconfirms any atheistic hypothesis. So I've kind of said that so you can kind of have some understanding going in, but now let's have some fun with this and jump in. I think there's a lot here we can sink our teeth into, and we are going to respond specifically to Shermer, but I think what we see here is a couple of things. First of all, it's different. It's a little bit of a different approach, but because it's a little bit of a different approach, and I saw some of you already pointing this out in the chat as we began, before we began, is that Shermer was so used to, and I don't mean any offense to him because Christians can do this too, but I think he was so used to having debates with Christians where a certain number of theistic arguments are trotted out in a resurrection case and all these kind of things, that he had in his mind already where this was going. So he ended up talking past David. He thought David was just bringing an appeal to authority, or just bringing a design argument or a cosmological argument. And David does mention those things in passing, but those aren't the arguments that he was bringing. And so this brings out, I think, the importance of understanding that we can get so bogged down in our party lines and in the typical way of responding that we don't notice when someone is doing something a little bit differently. So we really need to make sure we're not talking past each other and that we do understand what our opponent is saying. So with that, let's jump in and let David say a little bit about this himself.
Treating theism as a hypothesis, my argument runs as follows. Premise 1. No hypothesis in history has more scientific confirmation than theism. As we'll see shortly, this is a tremendous understatement. Premise 2. No hypothesis in history has more scientific disconfirmation than atheism. This also is a tremendous understatement. Conclusion, if we have any respect whatsoever for science, we must accept theism and reject atheism. Call this argument the defibrillator, because it's shocking and may lead to revival.
All right, so there's that great rhetorical ability that David has. So David has set up the argument, just as I've said. This is the overarching hypothesis. Now let's hear him unpack the three key elements that I've already mentioned, which is that the universe can be understood, that we are the types of beings that should be able we should be able to understand it, and that we would see this as a good thing. So let's listen to him unpack. And as I said, if you're just jumping in, I am playing more video than I typically would from these clips, but I think it's important to understand exactly what this argument is.
There are tons of scientific hypotheses being tested around the globe, but all of these ordinary scientific hypotheses are ultimately derived from the scientific hypothesis, capital S, capital H. The scientific hypothesis is the hypothesis on which science as we know it rests. There are three key elements of the scientific hypothesis. One, the universe can be understood. Two, we can understand it. And three, it's good for us to understand it. If you don't believe that the universe is, at bottom, rational, you're not going to spend years of your life gathering data to figure out its laws. If you don't believe that human beings are capable of understanding the universe, why waste your time trying? If you don't believe that it's good to understand the universe, why would you want to? So, intelligibility, the universe can be understood. Capability, we can understand it. And desirability, we want to understand it. These are the three key elements of the scientific hypothesis, and all three have to be in place for science to get off the ground.
All right, so what I want you to take away from this is when you typically hear people just say, well, the thing about it is, Christians may have pioneered the scientific revolution. They may have, primarily been the ones who got it started, but that doesn't speak to the truth of it. What somebody believes, and of course, this is exactly what Shermer's going to bring in later, but what somebody believes doesn't really, they might have been dog owners and they might love dogs. It doesn't mean that dog owning is the perfect thing or whatever. He brings in, or they might have been a Republican. It doesn't mean that just because they're Republican and they figured out something true, that means that we should all be Republicans. That is to completely miss exactly what's going on. What's going on here is he's saying it's not just that they happen to be Christian theists. It's that their Christian theism and the principles about it, the assumptions that are brought out by Christian theism and Christian philosophy in the Bible would lead one to a hypothesis. The hypothesis is, we could call it the theistic hypothesis as much as the scientific hypothesis. The theistic hypothesis is that if there's a God who created everything and he's a rational, intelligent God, and we are rational, intelligent beings, that we should be able to investigate this world in a rationally intelligent way and investigate the cosmos, and that we would have a desire to do this and see this as a good thing. Would atheism, if atheism is true, and I notice that every time I say, is atheism true, I have atheists who say, you don't even understand what atheism is. Atheism is just a lack of belief. We're going to get there in this video, right? I understand that, and I see that as one possible definition of atheism for people. I get that. But the point is, if one merely lacked a belief in God, would they ever have those desires? And David's going to answer that in just a moment. But simply put, why would you have such a desire, such an impulse for things that don't serve you practically speaking. And so this desire to understand the cosmos, to understand the world God made, is very important. And we're going to find out why scientists thought that was important in this revolution. Let's go ahead and take a look at what Maxwell Yates has to say. Brax, do you ever get tired from strawmanning Dr. Shermer, or are you jealous of his intellect, or perhaps jealous of his beautiful head of hair? I praise the day that God delivered me from the head of hair that I once had. It has been one of the great blessings of my life to be a bald-headed man. And Maxwell Yates is still quite young, so maybe he'll experience that at some point as well. And we'll find out if I'm strawmanning Shermer as we go on. All right, so let's go on now. And again, we're just getting through some of this initial video to understand exactly what's being said. So is it true? First of all, you would want to know, is it true that these pioneers of the scientific revolution really did have these motivations and these beliefs, and that it was a part of their hypotheses? Now, this is a 5-minute clip. I am not going to play all of it. I'm just going to play a little bit of it so you get a taste for it, but it's all in the original debate. So you can go back and listen to all of this in the original debate, but here, and I have it linked in the description, but here's just a taste of what some of them said.
Here we might wonder, why did these Christians dedicate their lives to understanding the universe? Let's ask them, and we'll allow them to answer from their own writings. It's time for Q&A with the pioneers of the scientific revolution. Here goes. First question. Nicholas Copernicus, the publication of your book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres generally marks the beginning of the scientific revolution. What were you thinking when you started this revolution? Copernicus's actual response. To know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his laws. Surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more gratifying than knowledge. Now that's odd. Sounds like his scientific research was grounded in his religious beliefs. He thought he was worshiping God by studying the universe. I guess we should ignore him and move on. Tycho Brahe. You spent decades recording astronomical data, and your measurements were 5 times more accurate than the best measurements available before you. Why did you spend so much time studying the stars? Brahe's response, those who study the stars have God for a teacher. Studying the stars because you want to learn from God. How weird is that? Galileo Galilei, you're called the father of modern observational astronomy. Why did you decide to give birth to modern observational astronomy? Galileo's response, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. When I reflect on so many profoundly marvelous things that persons have grasped, sought, and done, I recognize even more clearly that human intelligence is a work of God and one of the most excellent. Johannes Kepler.
So it could go on, but you see the point is that he is shoring up this claim that the things that, number one, the things that motivated these initial scientists was that they thought if there is a God, this is going to be an intelligible world that we can study. He sees that they see these things as the worship of God. As you move on, you find that some of these guys said, we as scientists are the priests of the book of nature. You know, we're again thinking of the book of God's word in terms of special revelation scripture versus the book of nature. That we can learn about God from looking at the world around us. Of course, that's grounded in the Bible in Romans chapter 1, verse 20. And also there's Proverbs. I'll have to go get the verse for that, but where it specifically hails from. But in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Paul says the invisible things of God's eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen through what has been made, so that they're without excuse. In other words, you don't have an excuse for not believing in God when you can look at the world around you, the book of nature, and at least learn some things about God, right? These scientists are saying we are the priests of that book of nature, just as they're priests of the special revelation of Scripture. So we have a responsibility, and it's an act of worship, and we can learn about God and all of these kinds of things. Why? Because their motivation, their hypothesis was the universe can be understood. We are the types of beings that can understand it because God would have set it up that way, that we would have the apparatus, the equipment that would be appropriate for pondering and studying the depths of the cosmos, and that's exactly what we see. And that we would see that as a good thing. That's the grand hypothesis. And so every time you approach any scientific experimentation or endeavor, what you are seeing is a bearing out, a support for. Whether the experiment passes or fails, you are seeing support for that grand meta-hypothesis, what he calls the hypothesis. But here's the next question. Why did these scientists come to hold these views? How did they develop this hypothesis? And that would point back to the theologians and philosophers that took what they learned from God's word and their thoughts about the world that God made and sort of poured into the thinking of their day that these scientists come from. So let's take a look at a couple of the philosophers that poured into this.
So the three key elements of the scientific hypothesis make absolutely no sense given atheism, but all three make perfect sense from a Christian perspective. Long before the scientific revolution, in the universities of Europe, which, oddly enough, were founded by Christians, medieval philosophers and theologians laid the groundwork for science, even before the universities were formed. Augustine said, "Let the Bible be a book for you so that you may hear it. Let the sphere of the world be a book for you that you may see it." Augustine tells us to read the book of nature. Recall Kepler declaring that astronomers are priests of the highest regard, priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature. And Boyle comparing the universe to a romance novel that you can't stop reading until you reach the end. Thomas Aquinas argued, since human beings are said to be in the image of God by virtue of their having a nature that includes an intellect, such a nature is most in the image of God in virtue of being most able to imitate God. Only in rational creatures is there found a likeness of God, which counts as an image. As far as a likeness of the divine nature is concerned, rational creatures seem somehow to attain a representation of that type in virtue of imitating God, not only in this, that he is and lives, but especially in this, that he understands. We are created in the image of God. One of the main features of this image is that we have an intellect and we reflect God's understanding when we understand. Medieval theologians also emphasize the correspondence between our cognitive faculties, our reasoning ability and so on, and the world. We're made to be able to understand the world. So out of theism, particularly Christian theism, flowed a set of ideas about the universe, about human beings, and about the goodness of knowledge.
Yeah, so again, there's a couple of things here to unpack. Number one, there is a connection. Now notice, it's not just that there's a hypothesis that the universe is intelligible and represents the thinking of a rational mind. But then secondly, that we should be the sorts of individuals, the sorts of beings that have the apparatus, the investigatory capabilities to then study that rational world. There's a cooperation between those two things that itself seems to indicate design, but is also a hypothesis born out of theology and philosophy. This is important. Now, what's the business about being made in the image of God? Well, what does it mean to be made in the image of God, biblically speaking? And by the way, for those of you who are skeptics and don't believe that it means anything to be made in the image of God because you don't believe that there is a God, it's important to understand if you're going to get the force of this argument and whether or not this is a hypothesis that stands to confirm theism, Christian theism, then it's still incumbent upon you to understand exactly what we mean, what Christians mean, what the Bible might mean when it says that we're made in the image of God. All right, so I've said this before on other episodes, but I'll say it differently now. So you basically have, in Genesis 1, you have this image of God mentioned. It's echoed throughout Scripture in various places. But here's one thing we can say about it. So if you want to figure out what it means to be made in the image of God, what every theologian agrees about is that it means that in some relevant way, we are like God. Now, I think I can take it a step further, and I don't think that there's any stretching here. I think this makes perfect sense to say, okay, if we're made in the image of God and the animals and plants are not made in the image of God, then one way to figure out exactly what the image of God might entail is to look at the ways that God is described and the ways that we are described to have those capacities and that the animals don't have. Or conversely, to say things that the animals cannot do that we can do and that God can do. And so that would be a way to figure out what it means to be made in the image of God. And there are several things that immediately come to mind. One of those things, obviously, is a sense of morality. As has been said many, many times, when a lion chases down a gazelle and rips it to shreds, we say that the lion killed the gazelle. We don't say that it murdered the gazelle, right? Because murder is a moral category that's reserved for human beings, because that sort of morality is something that's true of human beings and would be true of God, that he's a moral God and is concerned about moral precepts. But it would not be true of the animals, at least not nearly to the same degree. So that would be something that might be made in the image of God might entail. Another thing might be for Christians that we have a spirit and that God is spirit. Another thing might be that we have creativity. Now, obviously, some animals have creativity. Beavers building dams is a certain level of creativity, but not anything near what we have as human beings. You know, the animals that come the closest to our level of creativity are still light years behind where we're at. The same could be true of intellect. Obviously, animals all have varying degrees of intellect, but the closest animal to our intellect is still light years behind where we're at. And so we have an intellect. More than that, we find through New Testament revelation that we have an intellect that can be renewed. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." That transformed is metamorphos in the Greek, and it refers to an invisible process that takes place in human beings, not in any other kind of creature. So for that reason, what these philosophers, what these theologians, and therefore what these early scientists who were Christians understood was that we are made in the image of God. We have an intellect that is like his, in the sense that we are rational beings. So if the Bible is telling us that we are like God and that we have this intellect and this relational capability, this rational ability, then we should be able to look to the universe and it should map that if it was created by someone like us, obviously far greater than us, God, but someone who is also a intelligence, rational, and those sorts of things. And so we should expect it to map to that. Now, for those that say, again, and I mentioned this on a previous episode, when someone says, well, yeah, but the more we study about science, the further and further God is pushed away. No. The more we study the world around us, the more we find the applicability of mathematics, the more we find out, which of course is an immaterial thing, mathematics, that maps perfectly to the material world. That's weird. And these guys were aware of this. But as we move further, we find that, okay, the double helix of DNA is its own, has its own language system that then the RNA takes and pulls the DNA apart, copies it, takes it over here, builds a protein molecule. I mean, this is a language system. The more we find out, the more we learn that we find a cosmos that is intelligible and reflects a rational mind, and so it makes sense. And that's the hypothesis. So all of this makes sense of that initial hypothesis. So when Wood points to the hypothesis, we could almost say the theistic hypothesis, what he's pointing to is this meta hypothesis that stands over all the other things, that we should expect that as we are rational minds, that and we are intelligences, that when we look at the world, it should be intelligible and it should be rational and we should be able to investigate it. And it's just gravy that we would find that to be a good thing, a desirable thing to do that. By the way, if you think that these things that these scientists were concerned with is some ancient or at least medieval type thing that no one today would be all that concerned with, recognize, and I just noticed that Cameron just stepped into the chat, at Capturing Christianity, just hosted a debate between Graham Oppy and William Lane Craig, where they were struggling with and wrestling with this very question of mathematics and its applicability to nature. That is to say that nature is intelligible and rational in this way. Further, earlier this year, or maybe it was last year, Sir Roger Penrose had a conversation with William Lane Craig. And lest you think that William Lane Craig is just prompting these questions, in that discussion on Unbelievable, it was Sir Roger Penrose himself who prompted the discussion of the weirdness that this mathematical application is so appropriate and even so specific as it is. This is all to back up this grand hypothesis that David Wood wants to point us to. So I think that's very interesting. So what does all of this mean?
Now, if every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is confirmation of a set of ideas that flowed directly from Christian theism, and if the testing of these hypotheses led to even further confirmation of theism, what can we say? We can say that no hypothesis in history has more scientific confirmation than theism. But we can go even further. Since every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is confirmation of the scientific hypothesis, And as we've seen, all three of the key elements of the scientific hypothesis are fundamentally at odds with atheism. We can say that every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is disconfirmation of atheism. And if every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is disconfirmation of atheism, it's clear that no hypothesis in history has more scientific disconfirmation than atheism. The only conclusion to draw from all this is that if we have any respect whatsoever for science, we must accept theism and reject atheism.
All right, so there you go. So that's his case. We've covered now David Wood's case. I think we've gone over it to where it should be clear enough that you understand what he's saying. But just to recap it one more time, you've got the hypothesis of all of science. All of science hangs under this. And without these assumptions, science couldn't be done or wouldn't be done, couldn't and wouldn't be done. And that is that the universe can be understood. It's intelligible. It's rational. It reflects a rational mind. Secondly, that we are the sorts of beings that have the capacity to understand it, and that we see that as a good thing and that we desire to do that. Now, this is the interesting moment as we turn to Shermer now, that Shermer, I think, and I understand why, didn't quite understand exactly what was going on. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but it sure seems that he's grasping for how exactly to respond to this. One could retort and say, yeah, but that was Wood's opening statement. Shermer's opening statement is not supposed to be the moment in the debate where he responds. It should be the point where he, presents his own thing. And of course, we do see a lot of the typical party lines. We see some bumper sticker type atheist things. And I don't think I'm being uncharitable there. It seems clear that that's what he's doing. However, what's interesting to this is that he says that he's responding in his opening statements to what David just said. By the way, I want to say this is pretty cool. Tatiana is a new member here. Now, for those that are unfamiliar, for some reason, because I don't think we're supposed to be able to yet, we have been granted the ability by YouTube to have channel memberships here. And as I've said before, the reason to do that is not because you're going to get a lot of extra goodies. The extra goodies come with the Patreon membership. So if you are kind enough to want to support us here, I really appreciate that. And I would encourage you to do that at patreon.com/TrinityRadio. But if you want to be a channel member here, what you get is a few emojis of me. And I think here in the next week, we're going to have them for Pritchett too. And so that's pretty cool. And also you get a badge of the Trinity Radio logo that will change colors the longer you're a member. And so if you want to do that, I encourage you to just get in at the lowest. I think like $2 gets you a membership. I encourage you to do it that way because, but thank you, Tatiana, for doing that. That's so cool. I think you're the first one ever, at least as far as I know. So that's pretty cool. Thank you so much. Also, while I'm on the point, you'll notice I'm wearing my Trinity Radio t-shirt here. You can get those at Teespring. If you go search us, you can find the link to that store at trinityradio.org and then go to the resources page, and it's right there at the top. Also, we encourage you to subscribe so that you know when shows like this are coming in the future. Now, back to what we're doing here. But I think what we see is Shermer not quite kind of grappling with not knowing what to do here. And the best I think he thinks he can do is he kind of hits on the design argument. He hits on the cosmological argument sort of in passing, which really isn't what David is trying to do. I mean, David does mention design and cosmology, but only insofar as to say underneath this meta hypothesis, there have been other smaller hypotheses or other scientific discoveries that also stand directly to be support for theism directly. And so he mentions in passing design and cosmology, but that wasn't the point of what he was doing. The point of what he was doing is what we've been pointing out already, that there's this meta hypothesis. But I think it shows that Shermer is trying to struggle with exactly how to respond to this. As we're going to see, Shermer also tries to say that, well, this is just an appeal to authority. These people believe this, so we should believe what they believe. That's also not what's going on, at least not as truncated as that. So, but there are other things that Shermer says in kind of struggling to figure out what to say to this that I think allow us to sink our teeth into some other issues. So let's hear what one of the things that Shermer says here about proving a negative and what atheism is.
But then when I was on the Colbert Report, Stephen told me in the green room when he asked me about my religious beliefs that an agnostic is just an atheist without balls. So I thought, well, come on, Shermer. So, now I'm a skeptic because that's the name of my magazine. But really, it's just, I think it's very unlikely that there is a God. We can't prove that there is nothing. Can't prove a negative.
Okay, so couple of things. Let's first talk about, can you prove a negative? Actually, that's simply false. That's not up for debate. It's just wrong. You can prove a negative. The way you prove a negative, not every negative can be proven, but in principle, you can prove a negative. So, for example, are there any square circles in the physical universe? Are there any two-dimensional square circles? No, there are not. Do I know that because I've traveled to the farthest distance reaches of the universe to find out? No, it's just because the idea itself is incoherent. Are there any married bachelors? Same thing. No, there are no planets with married bachelors because it's an incoherent idea. We don't know that because we got on a SpaceX rocket and went all over the world, all over the universe to see if there are any. We know it because there's an incoherency. And so there are these families of arguments among atheists that are called incoherence arguments. And we look at several of them in a course at Trinity called Contemporary Apologetics 1. However, one of those incoherence arguments is the logical argument from evil. It's weird, and we're going to come back to this, that Shermer says you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that something does not exist, when in just a few moments we're going to see that he uses one of these incoherence arguments, the logical version of one, the whole purpose of which is to show that God, so defined, does not exist. Really weird. So yes, you can prove a negative, and that's how you do it. Second, so you would want to find something in the nature of God that is contradictory or incoherent, like a married bachelor or a square circle. And so people have tried to do that with arguments from evil, like the Epicurean argument. Others have done that with divine hiddenness sorts of arguments, things like this. And they all can be answered. They all kind of fail, but still, those are all there. So it's interesting, but it's weird to me that he does that and then offers one later when he says it can't be done. Next, I'd like to say that he says here, well, before I get into it, let me go ahead and say here, Fenica Apologetica says, thank you, by the way, for that super chat, says, what in the naturalistic worldview makes our cognitive abilities unable to discover the truth of the universe and reality? So the point here is that, okay, there are certain laws that lead to certain things. What we find is, why is it that way? Why is it that mathematics maps so specifically to reality when mathematics has no specifically causal connection to the material world? Mathematics, for example, is immaterial in that way. Why is it that there's this strange intelligibility? Why is it that the laws of nature are such that we can't investigate these things? And even if someone wanted to grant that all of that is the way it is by necessity, like it just had to be that way, which, for example, is what Oppie offered as the naturalistic hypothesis in the recent Craig-Oppie debate on the applicability of mathematics. Still, then the question would remain, why are we the type of beings that have this ability that maps to that matches that we would understand it, that we would be able to understand it? You could even go further with this, and this would take you more into a teleological or design argument, and get a book like The Privileged Planet, which argues that, look, we are actually, it's not, all that is true, but then on top of that, we happen to be on a planet that is in a specific place, in a specific solar system, in a specific galaxy, that is the right place to be able to observe and study the universe around us. All of this amounts to a different kind of design argument, we could say, than what you typically hear. So all of those things I think are important to consider. So thank you so much for that super chat. I really appreciate it. So now we come to this second issue, this issue of, hold on a second. He says, look, he was on Stephen Colbert's show, and forgive me, I'm going to say it the way he says it, though I consider it to be uncouth and perhaps sexist. But he says, to be agnostic is an atheist with no balls. Okay, but you could say the same thing about the type of atheist, a certain type of atheist, depending on how they act. All right, now I've mentioned this recently, but I'm going to mention it again here. So yeah, in other words, Colbert's saying, yeah, you're saying you're an agnostic, you just don't believe, right? Which is how many people define a soft atheism, which is not to say, I believe that God does not exist, but I lack the belief that God exists, right? Colbert's comment would be the same, I think, to that sort of atheism, the lack of belief sort of atheism as well. You're not willing to go all the way. You're not willing to have this courage of your convictions to say God does not exist. Have that courage of your convictions, I think, is how we can understand what it is that Colbert was probably saying in a humorous way. However, I don't think that's true or fair of all lack theists or lack of belief atheists. So let me explain why I think this is the case. If you are here's where here's where, if you're the type of lack of belief atheist who is not taking the position that God does not exist, but you're just saying, I lack the belief, all right? You could even say, I don't believe, but you're not saying, I believe that God does not exist. Then in that sort of a person is fine. I mean, like, there's nothing about that is initially upsetting, except for the fact that I want everyone to believe in God because I believe that he's the way of salvation and all these sorts of things. However, there's nothing about that that's necessarily excludes you from the grown-ups table of having a conversation with intelligent theists about these matters. There's nothing that excludes you from the grown-ups table if you're saying, I just don't believe, but I'm open. I'm willing to be convinced. Fair enough. However, and this only occurred to me about a month ago, if you are the type of person who says that, but then we find you elsewhere referring to it as a fairy tale, or it's like Santa Claus, or it's like the Tooth Fairy, all things that are fictional and that we understand to be fictional, or your Sky Daddy, all these sorts of derogatory things. And it's not that as you'll see in a moment, it's not the mockery itself that bothers me. But if you're that kind of a person, what you are doing is you are betraying that you actually do actively believe that God does not exist. By the way, you're talking about God as a fiction and comparing God to fictional entities that we believe to be fiction, that we know are fictional, right? Okay, that kind of person has no place at the grown-ups table. Who else does have a place at the grown-ups table? People who mock and say that it's like a fairy tale, it's like, Santa Claus or whatever, and then are willing to back that up with the courage of their convictions. Again, I think this is uncouth. I don't like saying it this way, but as Stephen Colbert would say, an atheist that is going to make those comments and has the balls to back them up, to say something, and again, that's not my terminology. I feel gross even saying it. That's not, I'm just echoing the statement made. But to say, okay, I'm going to offer you an argument to that effect, the logical argument from evil. I'm going to offer you a divine hiddenness argument. I'm going to offer you an argument to show that God does not exist. If you're going to make those kind of statements, be willing to have the courage of your convictions and back it up. You can have a seat at the grown-ups table and use all the mockery you want. You can have a seat at the grown-ups table and be a lack theist if you're not going to go away and then use these fictionalized terminology. But if you're going to say you're lacking a belief and you're going to later betray in your words elsewhere that you think it's a fiction, then that sort of a person doesn't have any place in reasonable discussions about these things, because such a person is frankly trying to, I think, and I don't ever like to guess people's motivations. I'm not saying it about any specific person, because frankly, Shermer does bring a logical argument from evil. But that to me is a way of trying to avoid having a burden of proof. No. If you're going to say it's a fiction, that's a positive claim. If you're going to unofficially speak as though it's a fiction, that's a positive statement if we phrase it formally. So you need to offer something. So I think all of that is an important thing to say about this. So is it true that you can't prove a negative? Not all the time. And someone could do it with God if God didn't exist, and in principle could do it. And Shermer does try to do it later, which makes it odd that he says here you can't prove a negative when he later kind of shows that he thinks you can. And secondly, to those Stephen Colbert things, I think there are some things we can learn from that. All right. Let's move on to the next thing, and let's see what he says about whether or not atheism is a worldview.
As for atheism isn't a thing. It's just a lack of belief in God. That's it. Full stop.
Atheism is just a lack of belief in God. Full stop. All right, fair enough. It's true that atheism is not monolithic. We've just been discussing that. I get that. And atheists hold all kinds of beliefs on a variety of issues. For instance, we have an episode from last year where I'm talking about atheists that are pro-life. In fact, one of the characters that I highlighted in the video was a college student, a young lady who's a college student who was pro-life, and she's an atheist. And she actually commented on the video and appreciated it, and I pinned her comment and everything else. So atheism is not monolithic. However, in an episode that we have on Is Atheism a Worldview from last year, I actually showed that if you look at the data, if you look at the statistical data from Pew Research Center, you find out that if atheism is a part of a worldview, it does impact other beliefs. There is a work by W.E.O. Quine that is called The Web of Beliefs. And in that, he likens worldviews, your worldview, what you make sense of all your beliefs, as like a spider's web, such that if you augment any part of a spider web, that change is felt across the entire web. It affects everything else in the web. And similarly, if you change something as fundamental as your beliefs about God's existence as the creator of the cosmos, that is going to have an effect on everything else, even if some of the things that it has an effect on, it's in a minuscule way. So can we speak of an atheistic worldview? I think we can. Let me offer some evidence for that. And again, this is a short clip, but it's from last year's video. I want you to stick with me and see this, see what the data is.
It does bring along with it, once your worldview position, once in your worldview there is the position of atheism, then that impacts everything else, or a lot of other things anyway. So let me give you an example of why that, or how we know that that's true. So let's talk about party affiliation in the United States. If you are an atheist, what political party do you think you're most likely to be in? And the fact is, I think that most of you already know, don't you? Interesting that. Why do you already know? Don't you already know? Because it's kind of not necessarily a given, but very, very likely that if you're an atheist, you'll be a part of the Democrat Party. Look at this. 69% of atheists are Democrat or lean Democrat, as opposed to 15% Republican and 17% no lean, because after all, they lack a belief in which political party they should be a part of. I'm just kidding around. So okay, there you go. There you go. Party affiliation among atheists. Percent of atheists who identify as, and then we have there 69%. This is from Pew Research Center. So also, we could go to abortion views about abortion among atheists. I mean, this is a big, whatever you think about this, this is a very hot button issue right now in our culture. This is a big deal. And when we look at the views among atheists, 87% say it should be legal in all or most cases. 11% think it should be illegal in all or most cases, and 2% don't know. So that's the abortion views among atheists. What about same-sex marriage? What do you think? Are you completely at a loss for what the answer is going to be? Of course you're not. You know the case is going to be that a large number of atheists are strongly in favor of same-sex marriage. Here we have 92%. What about the views on human evolution? What do you think that the chances are that we have a large number of atheists who don't believe in evolution? Well, let's take a look. 91%. Now, this is actually pretty interesting. There is 1% more atheists who believe in same-sex marriage than believe in evolution, but you still have 91%, as opposed to don't know, less than 1%. Always existed in present form, 5%. Evolved, don't know how, 1%. Evolved due to God's design, 2%. That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But anyway, views about human evolution among atheists.
So if atheism is a part of your worldview, obviously it's going to affect a lot of other things. So it is fair to talk about an atheistic worldview. Now, you can't say the atheistic worldview as if there's only one, but a worldview that contains atheism is an atheistic worldview, not only because it contains atheism, but also because that belief in atheism affects a whole lot of other things, really central things, really important things about the way the world is, about the nature of reality. So again, these are things that Shermer has said that aren't directly related to what David was arguing, but he's doing his thing, and it allows us to comment on some of these. Now, let's get closer to what he has to say about what David said specifically.
X looks created, whatever it is, the eye, the universe, planets, DNA. I can't think of how X was created naturally, therefore X was created supernaturally. This was, in essence, the argument he was making by rattling off all the scientists, Tycho Brahe, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and so on. They ran up against certain mysteries in their fields and said, well, I can't figure it out. I guess God did it.
Is that what he's saying? I guess God did it, but these scientists couldn't figure out design, and so they just attributed it to God. Is that what happened? Not really. That's not what David's trying to argue. What David is arguing is not the simple design argument and then couching it in the thoughts of the pioneers of the scientific revolution. What David is doing is he's saying, no. There is a meta-hypothesis, the hypothesis he calls it, that the universe can be understood, that we can understand it, and that it's good to understand it. That's all. That was made clear multiple times in David's initial statement. Now, David does mention, again, design as one of the things, and cosmology as another one of the things, but he only mentioned those momentarily and just in passing to almost to kind of, almost kind of separate that from what he's trying to say as his real argument. He just points out that as we've moved forward in science, there have been other minor hypotheses or minor scientific discoveries that have further confirmed this ultimate hypothesis, or that God exists. But that wasn't really his point. And then he says something really interesting along those lines that, again, really doesn't have anything specifically to do with what David was arguing, but another point that needs to be made. He argues that God must be really complex.
If you invoke the God hypothesis, there's a creator did all this. Any being capable of designing particles, atoms, molecules, DNA, protein chains, cells, organisms, planets, stars, and universes can't be simple. Such a being would have to be as complex as, or more complex than, her creations.
Okay, first of all, you'll notice that he said her creations. Let me just say something to atheists that use that as a rhetorical device. First of all, what's your intention? Is it just to annoy people? I mean, if that's just to annoy people, then why are you doing it? Just trolling? Secondly, it doesn't bother informed Christians. Why? Because Christians understand that God is spirit and doesn't have physical genitalia. I remember one time early in when I was pastoring a church, I went to a convention of the denomination that I was a part of, the Southern Baptist Convention, and someone titled their sermon, "Is God a Man or a Woman?" It was funny because the guy that spoke before him had the exegetical dilemma of the third participle of blah, 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 something like that. And this guy's thing was, is God a man or a woman? And of course the answer was no. God is spirit. God is Father. The Bible wants to give us an impression, a way to understand God. It gives us Father. Are fathers masculine? Yes, but that's not the point. The point is that this best couches or best captures how we're to understand God, but God doesn't have physical, biological genitalia. So for that reason, it's kind of silly when people make this point, and it shouldn't bother Christians because we don't think of God that way anyway. But to the point, is God complex? What Shermer is trying to say is, I don't know if he understood that this is how it comes out, but the way this shakes out is the universe is really complex. Therefore, the God who created the universe is really physically complex. Therefore, the God that created it must be physically complex. Same problem as thinking of God as physically male or female. God isn't physical, so he doesn't have to be physically complex and have moving parts and all these kind of things. In that respect, God is simple. And that's all that's important to say. That's just a misunderstanding about how Christians think about theology and how other faiths think about theology, frankly. But then he gets down to the root of his position, his case against theism, and it's the problem of evil. Let's hear what he has to say.
Now I'm going to make two arguments tonight against the idea that there's a God and in favor of the idea that we invented God. The biggest problem I see for atheists is the problem of evil. So pick two. 1, God is all-powerful. 2, God is all good. 3, evil exists. You can have 2 of those. You can't have all 3.
Okay, so now listen, understand, and we have for the patrons at the Patreon. By the way, in the Patreon we just added an entire course on the history of apologetics, but we have an entire course on the problem of evil, and it's 8 hours of material covering everything, including the problem of hell and the problem of the atrocities of the Old Testament and why does God tell the Israelites to go in and kill the Canaanites and all that whole thing. But this is interesting because there are 2 ways that you can approach arguments from evil. You can give what's called an evidential argument from evil, or you can give what's called a logical argument from evil. An evidential argument from evil is a probabilistic one. You're not saying, therefore, God does not exist or it's impossible that God so defined exists. You're just saying it's less likely. That is how most of your atheologians, and yes, there is such a thing, atheist theologians, approach this thing in philosophy to argue against God, is they use an evidential argument because it's harder to defeat an evidential argument. But atheists primarily on the internet, and we see it here with Shermer, we saw it with T-Jump not too long ago, that when you present a logical argument from evil, that is almost impossible for the atheist to sustain. Because what you have to do there is you're arguing that, you'll notice that Shermer brings a logical argument. The logical argument seeks to show it is not possible that a God so defined does not exist. You'll notice that Shermer said, let's just hear that part again. What did he say specifically about this?
Now I'm going to make 2 arguments tonight against the idea that there's a God and in favor of the idea that we invented God. The biggest problem I see for a theist is the problem of evil. So pick two. 1, God is all-powerful. 2, God is all good. 3, evil exists. You can have 2 of those. You can't have all 3.
So you can have 2 of those things, but you can't have all 3. What is he saying? He's giving a logical argument. He's saying you can't have all 3. But of course, that is almost impossible to sustain, which is why most of your atheologians have given that up completely, and it is almost a dead concept in philosophy. Again, I always like to point out there's a great book on this that I keep with me all the time, has an atrocious cover, but by Daniel Howard, edited by Daniel Howard Snyder, The Evidential Argument from Evil, which is a compilation of various Christian or theist and non-theist philosophers on this issue. They all say in there that it's at least most of them say, I think all of them say, that the logical argument is dead in the water. You've got the evidential argument, because all you have to do to shoot down the illogical argument that Shermer is bringing is to show some possible explanation why a God so defined might allow for evil. And of course, we have all kinds of ways to do that. We have character-building theodicies. We have free will theodicies, all those kinds of things. And as I point out many times, we have a short video on this channel that is in the short video playlist on why does God allow bad things to happen or something like that. So there you go. This is not that difficult to deal with, but guess what? David Wood doesn't even deal with it the way that I just did. Let's move on, though, and let's get into now another problem that is made, another mistake that is made by Shermer here.
But instead, he sacrificed his son Jesus, who is actually just himself in the flesh, because Christians are monotheists. So this violates the law of identity. A is A. A cannot be non-A at the same time. So the only way to avoid eternal punishment for sins we never committed from this all-loving God is to accept his Son, who's actually himself, as our Savior. So my final sentence. So God sacrificed himself to himself to save us from himself. This is barking mad. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be barking mad. Understand that we believe in Trinitarianism, and we don't believe in some sort of modal Trinitarianism where you have like God the Father became the Son and then became the Spirit. That's not how it works. The reality is that these are 3 persons, distinct persons, who share the being God. It's not one person and 3 persons. It's not one God and 3 gods. It's 3 persons, one God. So Jesus is not praying to himself in that sense. So God is not offering himself to save us from himself. That's complete. That is barking mad. That's complete misunderstanding of it. And I would have hoped that Shermer, after having so many debates with theists, that somebody would have pointed this out to him and that he would have that straight by now. That's just wrong. That's just not the way that it is. Yeah, Slam RN Shermer is so deep. That's right. I mean, that someone has to have told him that, right? And as for the idea, why does Jesus need to die? Why does God need to become a man and Jesus die on the cross? It all sounds so weird. I've said before, somebody ought to write a book, Why Christianity is Not Weird, or at least not as weird as you think. Because the truth is, if the idea is mankind sinned against God, and God wants to has to, because it's his nature to bring justice. He's also a God of love. What does he do? He brings justice. There is a punishment. If not, God is not a good God. He has to bring punishment because it wouldn't be good not to be just. But then he finds a way to do that by sending the Son to become man, to become God incarnate, mankind, so that he can pay the price for man. That's not a weird concept. It may be foreign to you. But it's not weird that, okay, man sinned against God, so someone's got to die on behalf of man. So the only person that could do that for all of mankind and everlastingly would be God himself. So God comes incarnate in the flesh and dies. It's just not that difficult. So enough with all the weird mischaracterizations of the Trinity and all these sorts of things. I would have hoped that someone would figure that out. All right. So now one of the things that I didn't play a clip from where Shermer brings is this thing of, we just believe in one less God than you do, right? We're all atheists. Everyone here, all the Christians, everybody is atheistic with respect to all but one of those gods. This is a party line. This is a bumper sticker. It's not even worth me playing, but David Wood does respond to it. Here's what he has to say.
He began by pointing out that we all reject most gods and that atheists just go one God further. There's a problem with that. We were already down to one, right? And well, some people just go one God further. Well, there's a world of difference between one and none. Here's a podium. Let's suppose we try to understand how this podium got here, and some of you believe that many people got together and built the podium, and that would be polypodium builderism. And others say, no, just get one good podium builder, then that's it. We'll call that monopodium builderism. And then you've got the atheist who says there was no podium builder, the podium just is. And we say, well, that's absurd. And the response from the atheist, it seems, is, well, you rejected all those other podium builders. I just went one more than you. Yeah, but we were already down to one. And in going from 1 to 0, you go from common sense to nonsense.
Okay, a couple of things I wanted to get right here real quick. William Keller says, what about Bayesian problem of evil? That would go under the evidential argument from evil. So that's the one that people do bring still. And some people that do that bring in the Bayesian stuff. Let's see, what was the other one? Somebody said, Tatiana asked, has Braxton ever debated Shermer? Is Shermer? No, I haven't, but that is one person who I am open to debating. I'm open to debating Shermer. I'm open to debating Dan Barker. There are several characters I'm open to debating because these are popularizers that have made a big impact. So I'm open to that. All right. So what do you mean we just believe in one less God? We were already monotheists, right? There's a big difference between there is a God who created everything and there's no God who created everything. Never understood why people still use that. I mean, it's really, I don't know. I guess somebody famous, who was it? Hitchens, somebody said that and it took off. Dawkins maybe. And so now everybody feels like they've got to echo that. All right, so let me show you, we're getting toward the end here, but I want to show you a couple more clips that I think are really helpful here. So first of all, what does Shermer say specifically about what David brings?
Now I'm going to go off the page and just respond a little bit to the defibrillator argument, as it were. It's irrelevant, the religion of the scientists who pioneered science. Some of this was correct, some of it not quite. It's a little more subtle than that. I'm a historian of science, but it's like saying, all the great art in medieval Europe was done by Christians. All the great music was done by Christians. Everybody was a Christian. It was almost against the law in some countries to not be a Christian. So who was going to do the music? Who was going to do the art? Who was going to do the science? In any case, it's irrelevant. It might as well say that they were all dog owners. So what? It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter.
He said that the religion of the pioneers of the scientific revolution is irrelevant. Now, if I were just doing this as an appeal to authority and saying, hey, look, lots of people believe in God, that would be absolutely ridiculous, because you could point to lots of atheists who are scientists and so on. That's not what my argument was. My argument was there were tons of civilizations, tons of cultures down through history, and these guys didn't just conveniently happen to be the ones who came up with science. Their views on the world and what they are and the importance of knowledge and their ability to find this knowledge came out of their theology. These came out of the medieval schools. And they found a method of going out and testing them. And so this was, in a sense, one massive hypothesis proposed and tested and confirmed. But the core beliefs that led them to go out and do this research were grounded in Christian theism. So how is that irrelevant?
So it's not irrelevant. So the point is not, look, because these are the guys that did it, and they happen to believe X, Y, and Z, we should believe X, Y, and Z. That's not it. It's that X, Y, and Z, namely their Christian theism, is what led them to the hypothesis. And as David Wood points out elsewhere, this could have happened anywhere among any kind of culture or group of persons. And it's not that there weren't scientific things that happened, but the scientific revolution happened as the result of the hypothesis that is Christian theistic at core, that Christian theism led to. And so that's the important thing that needs to be said. So Finica Apologetica, again, thank you so much. I appreciate the super chats. And she says, he or she says, Thank you, Braxton, for answering. Why did I assume that was a female? I don't know. Thank you, Braxton, for answering. Be blessed. Thank you so much for that super chat, no matter your gender or how you identify. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right. So one last thing that we want to nail before we move on, which is, what did David Wood say about the problem of evil position that Shermer said? And it's interesting because it shows that this actually falls into the same trap that David was laying the whole debate. And here it is.
The response is, well, why is there so much suffering? Even here, if I'm even trying to make sense of the objection, as he pointed out, there are people offer explanations, theodicies, and God does it for this or that, or religious explanation because of the fall or because of sin or something like that. Taking a step back from that, I can't even understand the criticism unless we have a moral law that we're all agreeing to somehow, unless we believe that there is a moral standard that we all must adhere to. Think about what the atheist is saying in these types of arguments. They're saying, hey, here's a moral standard that I am aware of that even God must adhere to. Does that make any sense whatsoever from an atheistic perspective? To say that that there is a moral standard that if God existed, he would be bound to, and two, that you have access to that moral law. This is very similar to the situation in science, where people are making all sorts of amazing claims about the universe, but they make sense on Christianity. They make absolutely no sense on atheism. And that's why Christians can discuss the problem of evil and offer theodicies and explanations and so on. And it makes sense to do that from within our worldview. But once you step outside of that, where you have no moral standard that you could possibly defend, now these things all break down, and we're left with nothing that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry about that. So Tommy S. makes a point that I wanted to come to. This was actually something I was going to mention before we closed out in a little bit. And that is, that he says, but just because it did happen doesn't necessarily mean that God exists. Right. So here's the thing. I think it's fair to say that this doesn't prove that God exists. And it doesn't prove that the Christian God exists. Of course, the topic of this debate is just, does God exist? And so that is a fair point that needs to be made. It doesn't prove it. But this goes back to something that I think happens a lot less in academia than happens among Christians and atheists on the internet, which is thinking that if you've got an argument, if it isn't a slam dunk, prove it, therefore no way of escape, slam dunk, sort of a deductive argument like that, then guess what? It's worthless. No, it's not worthless. It is a strong indication in a certain direction. It makes a certain position plausible. And that's all that a good argument needs, is that the premises are plausible, more likely to be true than false. So good point. That is a point that causes us to be more even-handed about what we're claiming here. We don't want to overstate our case, but I think that it's important. But what I ultimately think is important about all of this is to say, look, what we need to take away from something like this is when you hear Christians out there say something like, look, so what that Christians led to this revolution in science, that their beliefs led to this revolution, that doesn't mean anything. I hope that you'll do one of two things. I hope that you will link the initial debate and then have a further conversation with that person after they've viewed the debate. Selfishly, if you don't do that, or after you do that, maybe you could link this video in the future and say, see what you think about this, because I think that we need to clarify that there is more to that claim than what people often think. It's not just that Christians did this or were a part of this. It's that the motivations that led to it and the underlying beliefs that undergird science altogether in general are ones that spring forth most obviously and most comfortably from Christian theism. And that does count for something, even if you don't think that it's a slam dunk sort of a case. So that's kind of where I wanted to get to with this. And did anyone want to make a statement or have a question or something like that? If so, you can go ahead and make sure you put @Trinity Radio at the beginning so that I notice that. While you're doing that, I'll go ahead and scan back through and see if I missed anything. I'm sure that I did. I always miss stuff. Round 2 versus Dillahunty. I liked that debate. Maybe. I'm not closed off to it, but I don't see it happening, frankly. let's see. It is interesting that Dr. Shermer, the programmer, says, it is interesting that Dr. Shermer once said Christians doing any good is meaningless. Then he complains about the problem of evil. Right. That is interesting. By the way, I'll just mention in passing that I was watching a debate yesterday, really struggling through it, frankly, on modern day debates between scholar fiction and Reformed apologist, Reformed Christian apologist, Reformed Calvinist apologist, something like that, RCA. And of course, I'm not a Calvinist. So on the one hand, the Calvinist, who frankly, I appreciate that he was being consistent to his position, was saying about, the nature of certain evils that, hey, God did this, God does this for his glory and all those sorts of things. So because I don't, and then on the other hand, you have the atheist who scholar fiction, who wanted to keep saying, yeah, but this isn't about my position. This isn't about my position. I believe in subjective morality. Yes, yes, yes. Don't ask me about the Holocaust. Don't ask me about, I know you want me to say those things weren't really, really, really objectively wrong, but I'm saying it's subjective. But we're not talking about my position. And I'm sitting here looking at both sides and I'm thinking, okay, I believe that most individuals recognize, and of course we have arguments about this. Okay. So but just for shorthand here, I think most people intuitively recognize that morality is real and must have a grounding. So the atheist answer is completely unsatisfactory and doesn't explain, I don't think, the way the world is. Then on the other hand, we've got the Christian position, the Calvinist position, which says God decrees all this evil in the sense that Calvinists believe it. I don't think that answers it. I think we are responsible for this evil. Mankind is responsible for the evil in the world. So to say that it's not real, that evil isn't real in any meaningful sense, on the one hand, doesn't make any sense, especially if you're going to provoke about the problem of evil. Then on the other hand, you've got the Calvinists saying, yeah, and God decreed it. That doesn't make any sense to me. The most sense that can be made is, no, evil is real and it's not God's fault. It's our fault, right? And so I think a position, something like my position, that we have libertarian freedom and that we sin against God and that that mankind chose to rebel, I think that makes sense of it in the best way. That said, Calvinists are my brothers and sisters. Don't think that I'm attacking Calvinists here. Let's see what else we have. Anything else down here? Let's see. I'm not seeing anything else. So I'll tell you what, I'll take one more pass to see if I missed anything, going all the way back, as far back as I can go. And I'm not seeing anything. Listen, would you all do me a favor? If you're a skeptic or a Christian or a Muslim or whatever you are, if you show up for these things, would you just do me this favor and just go ahead and subscribe? It really helps me out. And we're trying to get to a certain level. We're trying to get to our next big goal is 10,000 subscribers. That's going to be huge. And when we move forward, we get these, it opens up new capabilities with YouTube to do other things and hopefully to make this channel more enjoyable for you. And even if you're an atheist, to make the conversation better. And so Christians and for sure, and atheists and anyone else, if you'll just subscribe, it doesn't cost you anything. I would really, really appreciate that. Thank you, Tatiana, for becoming a channel member. That's really fun. I appreciate that. Again, you can get the Trinity Radio gear if you go to trinityradio.org and go to the resources page, and you got the link there to Teespring, and that's cool too. But listen, this has been really fun. Let me make sure I don't have any more statements or anything. Yeah, the programmer says Scholar Fiction and Dr. Josh did a critique of your short video on the Old Testament God. I think Josh gave an interesting analysis and critique. You should check it out. Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed about them, specifically about Schuyler, is he tries really hard to be consistent. And I actually appreciate that about the way he does things. So he's one of the few atheists that has no problem just coming right out and saying, yeah, morality is subjective. And when I'm criticizing about the actions of God in the Old Testament, I'm trying to do an internal criticism. And so, of course, in my short video on the issue of the crimes in the Old Testament and that sort of thing, yeah, that's fun. Tatiana's using all the emojis. I appreciate that. But what I was saying, if you're going to do an internal critique, you have to do an internal critique. If I remember correctly, because I did watch that video on double speed, I think there were moments where we saw someone breaking the consistency of the internal critique and stepping outside of the critique, which of course is what you don't do in an internal critique. But in general, I want to pay a compliment in that I do think Scholar Fiction tries really hard to do that, to stay consistent with his subjective morality and he tries to do an internal critique and say that's what he's doing. So there's that. All right. Well, listen, I've really enjoyed this. This has been a fun one for me, and I hope that you all have enjoyed it. And I'm going to go ahead and start the music here. And listen, I'm going to stick around for a little bit, even after the closeout screen is put up there. But I hope you've enjoyed this. And listen, thank you for being here. It's always such an encouragement to see the chat going on, to see you all out there. So thank you so much. And I'll see you next time on Trinity Radio. Tatiana, I understand completely. Tatiana, I understand completely. My daughter has just discovered the child's version of Facebook Messenger, and even while I'm recording this, has constantly sent me emojis. It's really annoying that I'm having to consider blocking my daughter. Thanks, Jim Amberg. I really appreciate it. You're going to get here. You said you're in the middle and you like the debate reviews. Thank you so much. Tyler says, when did you go to Turkey? Went to Turkey in fall of I don't know if you can hear me, fall of 2017. No, 2018 for a month.